If you're trying to conceive and quietly wondering if life can be whole without a baby, feeling anxious, uncertain, or weary in your faith, you're not alone. Welcome to the Infertility and Trying to Conceive podcast for Christian women. I'm Linda Renee, an Aussie wife, mum, and follower of Jesus. Here I share biblical truth, simple conception tips, offer emotional support, and have honest conversations about what struggling to conceive really looks like as a Christian woman. My prayer is that this podcast lightens your load, keeps you anchored in Christ, and helps you move forward with confidence, peace, and hope. Christ goes before you, and I'm right here helping you look to Him every step of the way. Let's begin. Hi, and welcome to the first episode of this podcast. Since this is the very first episode, I thought a good place to start would be by sharing my own story of trying to conceive and the struggles and setbacks that my husband and I faced along the way. This is so you can know a little bit more of who I am and why I have a real heart for other Christian women facing similar struggles. My hope is that as you listen today and in future episodes, that my story will resonate with you and help you feel less alone and instill hope about your own journey. So I'll start with when I first met my husband, Brad. We were kind of young adults at church, and even though our personalities, they were quite different, we'd both grown up in Christian families, and we kind of carried that classic Christian picture in our heads of, you meet someone, you get married, you have kids, and you build a faithful life together. We didn't really want to wait too long for children, but we also wanted to build a strong foundation as a couple. So we decided to hold off having kids for a few years. And around our second year anniversary, we planned a big trip overseas to Europe and Israel. And then we thought, we'll come home and we'll start our family. It kind of felt like the perfect timeline. Life was full of expectation and hope at that point. Brad had a career as a forest firefighter, and I'd finished my nursing degree and was doing postgrad Bible college studies and had been leading the women's ministry at our church. And that first month of trying, it was really filled with excitement. Everything kind of felt like a possibility. And I think part of why I felt so optimistic was because I didn't really know that many people who'd actually struggled to get pregnant. Or if they had, they really didn't share much about it. And so I really didn't think I had a reason to expect many difficulties. And I also went to a Christian high school growing up. And really, the only education that I ever remember that slightly addressed sex ed or fertility was when a teacher read the Atonement Child by Francine Rivers. It was a book that I really loved because it made me think deeply about life and faith. But I think anything practical about fertility was just quietly avoided at our school. And outside the Christian world, the loudest message that females really get is just that you're super fertile and that you should do everything you can to avoid pregnancy. So almost nothing was said about really struggling to conceive. And so this was kind of my reference point. And before I go any further, I just want to give some context that shaped a lot of my own personal infertility experience. I was actually born with a condition called cystic fibrosis. And you might know cystic fibrosis or have heard about it if you've seen the movie 5 Feet Apart. Basically, cystic fibrosis creates a sticky gel-like production within the body, and that sort of stops certain organs from functioning as they should. Usually it affects the lungs and the digestion, but for me, it actually affected my liver a lot too. And life expectancy with CF, it wasn't very high when I was diagnosed as a baby. And so my parents actually took me to the elders in our church and they prayed over me for healing. And it wasn't immediately obvious at the time because, over the years, we did see that my lungs were actually pretty similar to people who didn't have CF. And my specialists, they sort of saw this as a medical miracle. They couldn't believe it. But all the Christians in my sphere, including me, we believed it wasn't just simply a medical miracle, but it was a supernatural miracle from God. And because of this, I figured that my fertility would sort of be safeguarded as well. Seeing God had looked after me so well, throughout the rest of my life, surely something like having children, he just let that had come simply and easily. And I knew men with CF, they couldn't conceive without fertility treatment, but I did know women with cystic fibrosis who had kids. And so I just didn't think that was, going to be an issue. And Honestly, I really just did. I just wanted my life to pan out how I pictured it. I just wanted it to be straightforward, and just the same experience as what my friends had. And my mum had conceived fairly easily, so I really didn't look too deeply into things. So, on a regular checkup with my liver specialist, we got a complete shock after I mentioned that we were trying to conceive. She went on to tell us that I actually had a 70% chance of going into liver failure if I got pregnant, with a 50% chance of survival. So, within moments, we went from like planning a family to potentially me dying if we even tried to have a family. So, and my cystic fibrosis specialist, she actually also agreed with my liver specialist, and she added that in Australia, the laws at the time they didn't actually allow people with cystic fibrosis to adopt because life expectancy was so low. So I was completely blindsided. Like I'd been healthy, relatively healthy my whole life. They'd even tested Brad for the most common cystic fibrosis genes before we got married, and they'd never once told us that children, biologically or adopted, wouldn't be possible. And I think what shook me, really to the core was what it meant for motherhood. It felt like the door had just slammed shut on both sides, and that news was just devastating for me. It was one of the heaviest moments of my life. So a few days later, with our minds kind of still in dazed chaos, we took a 6-day hike to into the Tasmanian wilderness in Australia. And after wrestling, with our thoughts and our fears on our hike, we decided the next best step was just to get a second opinion. And this really was a game changer. The new specialist was highly experienced in liver failure, and he actually estimated my risk was less than 1%. So it was the same condition, but two wildly different prognoses. So this was massive for us. We knew that God was bigger than statistics, but we also didn't want to just dismiss all concerns. We wanted to make wise decisions, taking into account best practice alongside the risks, benefits, and alternatives. And Brad and I wanted to honour and obey God, but it was kind of hard to know what exactly that looked like. And, we didn't know the outcome. And so many people in our sphere just seemed to have differing opinions on things. What we really probably would have benefited from was having solid and godly Christian people who had actually navigated similar situations and could relate to the struggles that we faced. But we just really felt like there was very few people who truly understood the weight that we carried. But in the end, I knew that I had to leave the decision in Brad's hands, as much as I longed to be a mum. At some point, I really just had to accept that the worst case scenario would actually probably impact him the most. Like, he could be left without a wife, he could be raising a newborn on his own, or he could be left without a wife or a child. So, yeah, in the end, he chose to go ahead. Just, he trusted that God's in control. And even though it was still a risk, it did give us a path forward, especially, knowing that adoption just wasn't an option for us anymore. And, the ethical questions, they still weighed on us quite heavily, like whose life was more valuable, mine or our potential babies? Would we consider ending a pregnancy to save my life if I went into liver failure? These weren't just theoretical discussions. They were real, decisions that we might actually have to face. And any pregnancy that I did have, it would be high risk, which just added to the stress. So even without liver failure being a factor, would my body even just cope? But we concluded that we just couldn't know for sure. We couldn't know for certain if any of those risks actually would occur. I'd been given high risks my whole life, and but very few had actually come about. And we knew that it didn't mean that it couldn't happen, but we also knew that well, we just didn't know if it would. I think the part that I found the hardest was I just wanted to know what the outcome would be, just so that I knew which choice to make, so that I knew one way or another, and just not be stuck in this holding pattern of uncertainty. And but that's generally not the way that God works today. He calls us to trust Him no matter what we face, good or bad. So, with this real sense of vulnerability, we just decided to step forward and trust that God was in control of all of this, including my life and any potential pregnancy or baby or complications that we faced. And we just were going to deal with whatever came next as we pursued this path of trying to conceive ourselves. So, with that, first bump in the road navigated, at least for that time being anyway, we continued trying to conceive again. And I started tracking my cycles more closely around this time. And I actually noticed they were really long, sometimes up to 80 days. And that's when I began to monitor like every single possible sign of ovulation, cervical fluid, using the saliva ferning microscope, basal body temperature. I even had a whole method worked out each morning just to get the most accurate temperature results. And later I added in, luteinizing hormone tests, which basically measure the hormone that peaks right before you ovulate. And for me, with cycles going so long, it just felt like this constant tracking and vigilance with such, very little results. And I really began to feel pretty deflated. And yet something in me just wouldn't let go. I felt like if I missed any little sign or symptom, my chances of conceiving that cycle would just be dashed. And so, I took supplements and prenatal vitamins and made lifestyle changes and, did fertility diets, daily exercise. I was determined to do all I could before moving on to the next step. And I didn't ignore the fact that it's God who determines life, but I also didn't know if a baby was something that was in his plan for me. And I just wasn't ready to accept that idea at that moment. I wanted to do everything I possibly could to optimize my fertility. So around the 6 month mark, I really, though, started just wondering whether there was something seriously wrong. And I knew it took some people longer, especially if they're stopping contraception, but I wanted to be on top of it. I didn't want to just sit back and not investigate in case there was a problem that could be easily and simply fixed. So I saw my GP who investigated, and they said that I had polycystic ovarian syndrome. My preference was really just to get to the root cause of the issue. So I explored holistic approaches and, things like acupuncture and herbs and castor oil packs to support fertility. But with all these things going on, intimacy with my husband it actually really started to lose its closeness. And baby making, it just consumed me and it felt more like a job. Getting pregnant became my sole purpose and goal in life. And that tension, it really created tension and that loss of connection with my husband and I. And this was just so far off from what we expected the journey of growing our family to be. And after struggling to conceive for about 8 months, I decided to ask my GP for a referral to a fertility specialist. Usually, doctors only refer you after a year of trying to conceive without contraception. But I really wanted to get the ball rolling before then, and I persisted in asking for an early referral. Something I think I was really passionate about when I was nursing was being an advocate for my patients, being their voice when they didn't have the capacity to speak up for themselves. And I think this really helped me be an advocate for myself when I would get resistance from some of my own doctors and specialists. And I'd kind of been used to getting negative opinions from them my whole life. And so I was okay to be the squeaky wheel at times. And I think it is always worth asking for a referral early because some fertility clinics or specialists, they can have quite long wait lists. And getting on the list means that if you haven't gotten pregnant by the exact 1 year mark, you hopefully won't have to wait too long if you haven't conceived by then. And naturopaths and integrative or functional medical doctors can also run a large range of fertility tests and provide you with great insights. Fertility specialists tend to focus on the medical aspects of getting pregnant, but I certainly think if you can, it's worth seeing someone who will go in depth with your health history and try and support your fertility at a root level. But at our first fertility appointment, our fertility specialist suggested basically to go with ovulation induction. And that was basically where he would monitor what my follicles were doing with blood tests and ultrasound monitoring. And then I would take an injection to trigger ovulation when I had a follicle that was mature enough. This sounded okay to us, but every cycle just ended with a negative result. And it was around this time that I actually came across a Facebook page for women with cystic fibrosis who were trying to conceive. And I saw that quite a few women had trouble conceiving due to their cervical fluid being so gel like that it was actually stopping the sperm swimming to meet the egg. And I decided to actually change fertility specialists at this point, and I found one who did a procedure called an IUI, or an interuterine insemination, in his private rooms that were close to my work. And an IUI, it's basically where the sperm are washed and then they're placed directly into your uterus with a catheter, which is kind of like a bit of a long, flexible straw. And although seeing a specialist in their private rooms was less complex than a big fertility clinic, it was actually really quite isolating because the main support, it was really just physical and medical. And here in Australia, it really depends on the state that you live in as to whether you're actually offered counselling. It's usually included in like an overall fertility treatment package. But I was just seeing my specialist privately. And so I just was paying for each thing separately. And so there was no emotional or mental health, support included in that. And the same went for spiritual support or community. This is a big reason why I'm so passionate about helping other women with infertility to provide support and encouragement because I think this topic can be really sensitive and even a little taboo for many of us. And if we don't feel like we can share these things with close friends and family, I think we can run the risk of becoming really isolated. And studies have shown that this can actually increase the risk of anxiety and even severe depression. And so I think there's just a really big need for deep support and community and connection, specifically for Christian women with others who understand and can not only relate to the physical and emotional struggles that infertility brings, but the relational and spiritual heaviness as well. Specialists and practitioners and doctors, they might focus on the physical side of things. But we also need to care about our emotional, spiritual, and relational health and well-being as well. So, coming back to my IUI experience, my new specialist put forward a plan that basically included taking Clomid, hormone injections, follicle tracking, a trigger injection, and then I would have an IUI. But we did a bunch of cycles, and in those cycles, my follicles either didn't mature or I got more negative results. And some cycles were just cancelled because I had more than one follicle. And my fertility specialist didn't want to risk twins alongside my risk of liver failure. I also went for a hysterosaplinogram or a HSG procedure to check for any blockages in my fallopian tubes, but there was nothing found there either. So, with each disappointment, I fell further into desperation. The ache of not conceiving had basically seeped into like every part of my life. It wasn't just the medical process, though, it was the weight of emotions and the stress. The decision fatigue and constantly asking, do we try again? Do we take a break? Do we change doctors? Do we spend more money? The stress never really left my body. And it was like living on edge all the time, running from appointment to procedure to scan and back again, waiting for news, waiting for results, waiting for the hope of a baby to either, become a reality or just to simply shatter again. And it seeped into my friendships as well. Like watching friends have kids, it was really special, but it also caused this deep ache in my soul. My hobbies for me really centered mostly on catching up with my friends. And so I really felt this sense of loss when their lives changed with having kids because I just wanted my life to change alongside theirs. But it wasn't. I was living in limbo, not knowing where life would go. And I and desperately wanting it to be in the direction of having a family. I wanted my kids to have play dates with my friends' kids. I wanted to experience that next normal, natural step in life. Even the times I'd meet friends, they'd often have their kids with them, and I didn't resent that at all because I loved their kids. But the connection I found just wasn't really the same anymore. They were often focused on their kids' needs, and our friendship just no longer seemed as important in their lives. And I understood this, but I just felt pushed to the sidelines, not intentionally, but it still felt like that all the same. And church for me, that used to be a really enjoyable and encouraging place to go. But now I just experienced feelings of isolation and I just felt like I was on the outer, watching everyone else move on with their lives. And I wasn't interested in climbing the career ladder at work. I just wanted to be a mum. My job just felt unfulfilling and it sort of almost became a means to an end. And through all of this, I was a Christian. I was a Christian who believed in miracles. I'd seen God's faithfulness in my life, but I just found myself questioning and comparing and confused as to why He wasn't answering my prayers in the way I expected. Why were others getting pregnant so easily? Even those just living their lives with really not much thought to it at all. And yet I just seemed to face so many obstacles. And people weren't intentionally insensitive or dismissive, but their attempts to encourage me would just often leave me feeling worse. People would ask if I'd truly handed this over to God, or they'd assure me it'll happen without any certainty, or they'd toss out the classic, just go and relax on a holiday, as if that were all it took. I knew God could do anything, but I also knew that His will may not include me having children. The thought it shattered my heart, and that really affected how I saw God. I often found myself thinking, why won't He just give me this good thing? Doesn't His word say that He will give good things? I knew His hand was over every single detail in this world, but I just couldn't understand why He felt so silent or why this was my lot in life. My pain began to turn into disillusionment and bitterness, and I wasn't sure if I could trust God like I used to. I prayed, I pleaded, I yelled, I bargained, I looked for signs. I was given words and visions, and yet there were just no promises or absolutes that I would have a child in my arms. And I couldn't understand God's ways. I desperately wanted answers and hope, and I got some from Scripture. And yet other parts of Scripture, they just seemed condemning and harsh. Others, seemed to provide just this false hope that just didn't line up with my reality. And I had no idea what to do with these scriptures. I knew God's word said that He hadn't abandoned me, but I felt so discouraged that a deep part of me began to question what I'd always believed. My thoughts they just constantly condemned me, along with other people's unwanted and unhelpful comments. And coming back to friendships again, I often felt like I was a burden to my friends, like I took away some of their joy when they announced their pregnancies. They'd kind of tell me their news awkwardly, like not knowing what to say, because they knew that they'd gotten what we so desperately wanted. And it was just so uncomfortable, and I would just often pull away from friends until I could finally announce positive news, if ever that came. I just felt like I was in limbo, with my life on pause until I got that positive result. And with each failed cycle, it just was like its own little grief. And you build up hope, you dare to imagine a positive test, and then it just all comes crashing down. So, around the 2.5 year point of trying to conceive unsuccessfully, our church mentioned that there was a talk happening locally on IVF for Christians. And although we weren't ready for the idea of IVF just yet, we decided to attend this talk and just to see what they said. But on the same night, while we were out for dinner before the event, we actually got the call to say that we had a positive pregnancy result. And of course, we were so excited and thrilled and overjoyed. But we actually kept this news to ourselves for about 4 to 5 months. For us, the longer the pregnancy went on, the higher the risk of liver complications for me. And so we just wanted to savor the joy that we had. We'd been through so much. We just wanted to savor that joy privately with just the two of us. And so this pregnancy, for all the potential complications that we'd prepared ourselves to expect, it actually resulted in yet a different drama. So at 27 weeks, which was about 6 months, my pregnancy was actually interrupted when I went into premature labour. And our son Jude was born via emergency caesarean. And he spent 3 months in the NICU before finally coming home. And this was just a whole new level of stress and an emotional rollercoaster ride. Living those early days wondering if our baby, who was now Earthside, was actually going to make it. We had so many ups and downs, but we eventually settled into somewhat of a normal routine once he came home. And about a year later, we went back to the fertility specialist to try for a second baby. And after 3 more rounds of IUIs, we conceived our daughter Ella, and she arrived at 38 weeks without any complications. And another year later, we headed back to the fertility specialist again, and we did a number of IUI attempts. By our sixth IUI attempt and my 12th IUI overall, Um, we were just wondering if it would ever happen again, and I wasn't sure how many more cycles that we could do. And at this point, I just asked my fertility specialist if we could go ahead with the cycle, even though I had more than one mature follicle. And he didn't really love the idea, but he agreed cautiously. And a few weeks later, at a scan on my liver, they actually saw two sacs. So we were pregnant with twins. Sometimes I look back and I wonder if I was reckless. And yet, over the years, Brad and we found our prayers had begun to change from just, Lord, please give us what we want, to Lord, no matter what happens, no matter what we face, no matter what you bring into our lives, please help us to become more like Jesus through it all for your glory. And the struggles never stopped, but we learnt that how we went through the struggles really mattered most to God. And being pregnant with twins, it really brought a new set of stress and anxiety and fear and worry. But regardless of the outcome, I was determined to continue putting one foot in front of the other, trusting that God had this situation in hand no matter what happened. The pregnancy, despite all the concerns, actually went smoothly, and April and Lucas arrived slightly prematurely at 35 weeks and spent a short time in the NICU before coming home. I learnt that a positive pregnancy result, it didn't mean that stress and hardship in life just faded away. New struggles will always arise. What I did learn, though, was how to lean on tools and strategies to grow stronger, while trusting God with each heavy, stressful step along the way. I discovered just how life-changing it was to keep Christ and eternal things at the center of my mind and my heart. And these are some things that I'll share more in future episodes. So that's basically a little look at how this journey unfolded for me. It was messy and it was much harder than I ever imagined. And although I can't guarantee that you'll have a baby in your arms, it can be encouraging to know that in the face of many odds and obstacles, it is possible. So no matter where you are on this journey, it's not unreasonable to have hope that it will happen for you. But I do think there's an element of having balance, of accepting that it also may not be the path that God has for all of us. There's such a mixture of feelings in all of this, and holding the belief that God can do what may seem impossible alongside accepting that He may have a different path to the one you imagined is something that I've really had to learn the hard way. And sometimes it also might mean that the idea of how you become a mum may also need to shift. Brad and I will always be that couple who went through infertility. But that's just a part of me. It's just a part of my life, and it's not my whole life. I've often wondered why me? Why infertility? It's something that I just simply don't know. I've just had to leave it in God's realm and His overall wisdom and trust that even though it was hard and a really hard thing to go through, that He was and He still is working for my good and His glory. Someone who doesn't know my journey might simply just see a woman now who has 4 kids, and from the comments that I've received, they just assume that Brad and I actually don't even know what contraception is. And they literally have no idea the struggle and heartache we went through to get to this point. Could God have worked His plans so that infertility wasn't part of our experience? Yeah, I believe so. And even though I wouldn't wish it on anyone, it really became, or infertility for me became a watershed moment in my faith. I had to decide, would I press into Him closer or would I turn away? It also humbled me, shaping a deep compassion for others, in those really hard places because I understood that pain firsthand. And because my journey impacted me so much, especially in my faith and my emotional well-being, I have a real heart to support you if you're in a similar place. When you're on this journey of trying to conceive, it's just so valuable and comforting to have support and encouragement from those who see the world through a Christian lens like you do, to find community and be encouraged and prayed for and walk beside one another so that you just don't feel like you're alone in this. And so that's why I'm also so open about sharing my story, sharing insights, what I learnt not to do, and what I wish I'd known, so that you don't feel so discouraged by infertility and that your faith and trust in God stays solid rather than fading. You might have been trying for much longer than I ever did. Or, you may have experienced loss or multiple losses or other big decisions that weigh heavily on you. All of our paths will look different, but we also have many common threads in the experience of wanting to be mums. And so I hope that can draw us together as sisters in Christ. And while I'm standing on the other side of that season now, I don't forget what it felt like. I carry those memories, those emotions, those scars. They shaped me in ways that I will share in other episodes, but they were experiences that were deeply painful. And yeah, I wouldn't wish them on anyone. And yet they made me look at my life and reflect and process and realize that God has an eternal purpose for my life, no matter what the journey to get there looks like. Before you go, thank you so much for listening. I pray today's episode has brought you fresh hope for whatever comes next. If someone comes to mind today who could truly use support in this space, please share this episode or the podcast with them. It might be exactly what they need. And if you could take 30 seconds to give me a star rating or leave 1 or 2 sentences about what this podcast has meant to you on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I'd be ever so grateful. Your feedback not only helps others find the podcast, but it truly makes my day. And words of affirmation are my love language. And if you're not sure how to do that, I'll pop the links in the show notes below. Lastly, although I do have a nursing degree, everything shared in this podcast is for inspiration and education only. Please don't use it as a replacement for advice from your personal, medical or mental health professional. There's absolutely no shame in getting additional support when you need it, but always consult your expert team before making any changes to your fertility journey. That's all from me today. Take care, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.